Please excuse any mispronunciations by TTS. The English TTS has trouble with non-English words. But, if you watch Zentreya, you should be fine. As a result of YouTube's rules pertaining to links in descriptions, I will be adding site details to the video.
List of music genres and styles. This is a list of music genres and styles. Music can be described in terms of many genres and styles. Classifications are often arbitrary, and may be disputed, and closely related forms often overlap. Larger genres and styles comprise more specific subcategories. Classical music has been around for thousands of years, and has influenced every type of music that came after. Any person who claims to like music should know at the very least, Johann Sebastian Bach, Vivaldi, or Rousseau. I won't be including samples of the music in the videos, for copyright reasons. I hope you enjoy the article.
The classical period was an era of classical music between roughly 1750 and 1820. The classical period falls between the Baroque and Romantic periods. Classical music has a lighter, clearer texture than Baroque music but a more varying use of musical form, which is, in simpler terms, the rhythm and organization of any given piece of music. It is mainly homophonic, using a clear melody line over a subordinate chordal accompaniment, but counterpoint was by no means forgotten, especially in liturgical vocal music and, later in the period, secular instrumental music. It also makes use of style galant, which emphasizes light elegance in place of the Baroque's dignified seriousness and impressive grandeur. Variety and contrast within a piece became more pronounced than before, and the orchestra increased in size, range, and power. The harpsichord was replaced as the main keyboard instrument by the piano. Unlike the harpsichord, which plucks strings with quills, pianos strike the strings with leather-covered hammers when the keys are pressed, which enables the performer to play louder or softer and play with more expression. In contrast, the force with which a performer plays the harpsichord keys does not change the sound. Instrumental music was considered important by classical period composers. The main kinds of instrumental music were the sonata, trio, string quartet, quintet, symphony, and the solo concerto, which featured a virtuoso solo performer playing a solo work for violin, piano, flute, or another instrument, accompanied by an orchestra. Vocal music, such as songs for a singer and piano, choral works, and opera, was also important during this period. The best-known composers from this period are Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Ludwig van Beethoven, and Franz Schubert. Other names in this period include Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, Johann Christian Bach, Luigi Boccherini, Domenico Cimarosa, Joseph Martin Krauss, Muzio Clementi, Christoph Willibald Gluck, Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf, André Gritry, Pierre Alexander Monsigny, Leopold Mozart, Michael Haydn, Giovanni Paisiello, Johann Baptist Wanhal, François-André Dainican Philidor, Niccolò Piccinni, Antonio Salieri, Etienne Nicolas Méhul, George Christoph Wagenseil, Johann Simon Mayer, George Matthias Mann, Johann Gottlieb Graun, Karl Heinrich Graun, Franz Benda, George Anton Benda, Johann George Albrechtsberger, Mauro Giuliani, Christian Canabiche, and the Chevalier de St. George's. Beethoven is regarded either as a Romantic composer or a classical period composer who was part of the transition to the Romantic era. Schubert is also a transitional figure, as were Johann Nepomuk Hummel, Luigi Cherubini, Gaspare Spontini, Gioacchino Rossini, Carl Maria von Weber, Jan Ladislav Dussek and Niccolò Paganini. The period is sometimes referred to as the era of Viennese classicism, since Gluck, Haydn, Salieri, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert all worked in Vienna. Classicism. In the middle of the 18th century, Europe began to move toward a new style in architecture, literature, and the arts, generally known as neoclassicism. This style sought to emulate the ideals of classical antiquity, especially those of classical Greece. Classical music used formality and emphasis on order and hierarchy, and a clearer, cleaner style that used clearer divisions between parts, brighter contrasts, and tone colors. In contrast with the richly layered music of the Baroque era, classical music moved towards simplicity rather than complexity. In addition, the typical size of orchestras began to increase, giving orchestras a more powerful sound. The remarkable development of ideas in natural philosophy had already established itself in the public consciousness. In particular, Newton's physics was taken as a paradigm. Structures should be well-founded in axioms and be both well-articulated and orderly. This taste for structural clarity began to affect music, which moved away from the layered polyphony of the Baroque period toward a style known as homophony, in which the melody is played over a subordinate harmony. This move meant that chords became a much more prevalent feature of music, even if they interrupted the melodic smoothness of a single part. As a result, the tonal structure of a piece of music became more audible. The new style was also encouraged by changes in the economic order and social structure. As the 18th century progressed, the nobility became the primary patrons of instrumental music, while public taste increasingly preferred lighter, funny comic operas. This led to changes in the way music was performed, the most crucial of which was the move to standard instrumental groups and the reduction in the importance of the continuo. The rhythmic and harmonic groundwork of a piece of music, typically played by a keyboard and usually accompanied by a varied group of bass instruments, including cello, double bass, bass viol, and theorbo. One way to trace the decline of the continuo and its figured chords is to examine the disappearance of the term obbligato, meaning a mandatory instrumental part in a work of chamber music. In Baroque compositions, additional instruments could be added to the continuo group according to the group or leader's preference. In classical compositions, all parts were specifically noted, though not always notated, so the term obbligato became redundant. By 1800, basso continuo was practically extinct, except for the occasional use of a pipe organ continuo part in a religious mass in the early 1800s. Economic changes also had the effect of altering the balance of availability and quality of musicians. While in the late Baroque, a major composer would have the entire musical resources of a town to draw on, the musical forces available at an aristocratic hunting lodge or small court were smaller and more fixed in their level of ability. This was a spur to having simpler parts for ensemble musicians to play, and in the case of a resident virtuoso group, a spur to writing spectacular, idiomatic parts for certain instruments, as in the case of the Mannheim Orchestra, or virtuoso solo parts for particularly skilled violinists or flutists. In addition, the appetite by audiences for a continual supply of new music carried over from the Baroque. This meant that works had to be performable with, at best, 1 or 2 rehearsals. Even after 1790, Mozart writes about the rehearsal, with the implication that his concerts would have only 1 rehearsal. Since there was a greater emphasis on a single melodic line, there was greater emphasis on notating that line for dynamics and phrasing. This contrasts with the Baroque era, when melodies were typically written with no dynamics, phrasing marks, ornaments, as it was assumed that the performer would improvise these elements on the spot. In the classical era, it became more common for composers to indicate where they wanted performers to play ornaments such as trills or turns. The simplification of texture made such instrumental detail more important, and Alizzo made the use of characteristic rhythms, such as attention-getting opening fanfares, the funeral march rhythm, or the minuet genre, more important in establishing and unifying the tone of a single movement. The classical period also saw the gradual development of sonata form, a set of structural principles for music that reconciled the classical preference for melodic material with harmonic development, which could be applied across musical genres. The sonata itself continued to be the principal form for solo and chamber music, while later in the classical period, the string quartet became a prominent genre. The symphony form for orchestra was created in this period. The concerto grosso, a very popular form in the Baroque era, began to be replaced by the solo concerto, featuring only one soloist. Composers began to place more importance on the particular soloist's ability to show off virtuoso skills, with challenging, fast scale and arpeggio runs. Nonetheless, some concerti grossi remained, the most famous of which was Mozart's Sinfonia Concertante for violin and viola in E-flat major. Main characteristics. In the classical period, the theme consists of phrases with contrasting melodic figures and rhythms. These phrases are relatively brief, typically 4 bars in length, and can occasionally seem sparse or terse. The texture is mainly homophonic, with a clear melody above a subordinate chordal accompaniment, for instance an Alberti bass. This contrasts with the practice in Baroque music, where a piece or movement would typically have only one musical subject, which would then be worked out in a number of voices according to the principles of counterpoint, while maintaining a consistent rhythm or meter throughout. As a result, classical music tends to have a lighter, clearer texture than the Baroque. The classical style draws on the style galant, a musical style which emphasized light elegance in place of the Baroque's dignified seriousness and impressive grandeur. Structurally, classical music generally has a clear musical form, with a well-defined contrast between tonic and dominant, introduced by clear cadences. Dynamics are used to highlight the structural characteristics of the piece. In particular, sonata form and its variants were developed during the early classical period and was frequently used. The classical approach to structure again contrasts with the Baroque, where a composition would normally move between tonic and dominant and back again, but through a continual progress of chord changes and without a sense of arriva at the new key. While counterpoint was less emphasized in the classical period, it was by no means forgotten, especially later in the period, and composers still used counterpoint in serious works such as symphonies and string quartets, as well as religious pieces, such as masses. The classical musical style was supported by technical developments in instruments. The widespread adoption of equal temperament made classical musical structure possible, by ensuring that cadences in all keys sounded similar. The fortepiano and then the pianoforte replaced the harpsichord, enabling more dynamic contrast and more sustained melodies. Over the classical period, keyboard instruments became richer, more sonorous, and more powerful. The orchestra increased in size and range, and became more standardist. The harpsichord or pipe organ basso continuo role in orchestra fell out of use between 1750 and 1775, leaving the string section. Woodwinds became a self-contained section, consisting of clarinets, oboes, flutes, and bassoons. While vocal music such as comic opera was popular, great importance was given to instrumental music. The main kinds of instrumental music were the sonata, trio, string quartet, quintet, symphony, concerto, and light pieces such as serenades and divertimentos. Sonata form developed and became the most important form. It was used to build up the first movement of most large-scale works in symphonies and string quartets. Sonata form was also used in other movements and in single, stand-alone pieces such as overtures. History. Baroque/Classical transition. Classical period instruments. Guitar. The Baroque guitar, with 4 or 5 sets of double strings or courses and elaborately decorated sound hole, was a very different instrument from the early classical guitar, which more closely resembles the modern instrument with the standard 6 strings. Judging by the number of instructional manuals published for the instrument, over 300 texts were published by over 200 authors between 1760 and 1860. The classical period marked a golden age for guitar. Strings. In the Baroque era, there was more variety in the bowed-stringed instruments used in ensembles, with instruments such as the viola d'amore and a range of fretted viols being used, ranging from small viols to large bass viols. In the classical period, the string section of the orchestra was standardized as just 4 instruments. Violin. In orchestras and chamber music, typically there are first violins and second violins, with the former playing the melody and slash or a higher line and the latter playing either a counter melody, a harmony part, a part below the first violin line in pitch, or an accompaniment line. Viola. The alto voice of the orchestral string section and string quartet, it often performs inner voices, which are accompaniment lines which fill in the harmony of the piece. Cello. The cello plays 2 roles in classical era music. At times it is used to play the bass line of the piece, typically doubled by the double basses. When cellos and double basses read the same bass line, the basses play an octave below the cellos, because the bass is a transposing instrument, and at other times it performs melodies and solos in the lower register. Double bass. The bass typically performs the lowest pitches in the string section in order to provide the bass line for the piece. In the Baroque era, the double bass players were not usually given a separate part. Instead, they typically played the same basso continuo bass line that the cellos and other low-pitched instruments, albeit an octave below the cellos, because the double bass is a transposing instrument that sounds one octave lower than it is written. In the classical era, some composers continued to write only one bass part for their symphony. Labeled bassi, this bass part was played by cellists and double bassists. During the classical era, some composers began to give the double basses their own part. Woodwinds. It was commonplace for all orchestras to have at least two winds, usually oboes, flutes, clarinets, or sometimes English horns. Patrons also usually employed an ensemble of entirely winds, called the harmony, which would be employed for certain events. The harmony would sometimes join the larger string orchestra to serve as the wind section. Piccolo. Used in military bands. Flute. Oboe. English horn. Clarinet. Basset horn. Basset clarinet. Clarinet d'amore. Bassoon. Contrabassoon. Bagpipe. Percussion. Timpani. Bass drum. Cymbals. Triangle. Tambourine. Keyboards. Clavichord. Fortepiano. The forerunner to the modern piano. Harpsichord, the standard Baroque-era basso continuo keyboard instrument, was used until the 1750s, after which time it was gradually phased out and replaced with the fortepiano and then the piano. By the early 1800s, the harpsichord was no longer used. Organ. Brasses. Natural horn. Natural trumpet. Sackbut. Trombone precursor. Keyed trumpet. Serpent. Commonplace in military bands. Post horn.